The moment Ellen Hale heard his name spoken aloud at the edge of the gathering ground, her hands went still over the bread dough she had been working, and the entire world seemed to contract around her like a fist closing. "Oliver Shepard," said Dottie Marsh, the blacksmith's wife, and her voice carried across the open air of Cartwright's flat with the peculiar resonance of someone who understood the weight of the words she was releasing. "They're saying Oliver Shepard came down off the mountain last night. Walked right into Harlan Teague's store at 10:30 and asked for flour and nails and didn't say a word to anyone about anything." Ellen's breath did not come out. It simply stopped living inside her chest. She had not heard that name spoken by another human being in 6 years. She had trained herself never to speak it, had trained the people who loved her never to bring it up in her presence, had constructed her entire daily existence around the careful architecture of its absence. 6 years. And here was Dottie Marsh standing at the edge of the communal baking table with flour on her own apron and complete ignorance of what she was detonating. "He looked different," Dottie went on, because Dottie always went on. "Bigger, harder in the face. Harlan said he had a beard down to here." She touched her collarbone with 2 fingers. "6 years up on that mountain alone will do something to a man, I suppose. Nobody could figure out why he came. He hasn't been down for the spring gathering since that business with the Hale girl." The Hale girl. That was her. That had always been her, in the collective memory of Cartwright's flat, Colorado, in the year 1883. The Hale girl who had stood at the altar of the First Presbyterian Church in the summer of 1877 and watched Oliver Shepard not come through the door. The Hale girl who had waited for 45 minutes while the congregation grew restless and her father grew red in the face, and her dress grew heavier with every passing second. The Hale girl who had eventually understood that the man she had loved since she was 18 years old had chosen the mountain over her. That was the story everyone knew. There was another story underneath it, one that had been buried under 6 years of silence and deliberate forgetting, one that involved a letter Ellen had written and a secret she had kept, and a terrible choice that had not been hers alone to make, though she had made it as though it were. That story had teeth, and it had waited with the patience of mountains to bite, and now Oliver Shepard had walked down off his mountain in the middle of spring gathering week for the first time in 6 years, and Ellen could feel those teeth finding her at last. She pressed her hands back into the bread dough. She made herself breathe. "Thank you, Dottie," she said, and her voice came out steady, which was one of the great performances of her 26 years on this earth. Dottie looked at her with the careful pity of someone who knew she had said something she probably should not have and could not now unsay it. "Ellen, honey, I didn't think. I'm sorry." "Nothing to be sorry about," Ellen said. "He's a free man. He can come down whenever he pleases." She worked the dough. She did not look up, and inside her chest, where the name Oliver Shepard had just been dropped like a stone into still water, the ripples spread and did not stop. She had been 17 when she first saw him. He had come into Cartwright's flat with the Morrison family, who were distant cousins of his on his mother's side, and he had been 20 years old and so serious in the face that she had mistaken him initially for someone much older. He had dark brown hair that fell across his forehead when he leaned down to look at something, and eyes the color of a winter creek, gray-green and deep, and always appearing to be calculating something just below the surface of whatever he was actually saying. Her father, George Hale, owned the general store and the small lending library that occupied a back corner of it, which was the only lending library in Cartwright's flat and possibly the only one within 40 miles in any direction. Oliver Shepard had come into the store on his second day in town and had stood in front of the lending library shelf for 20 minutes reading the spines of books with such complete absorption that Ellen, who was supposed to be counting inventory, had watched him instead and lost count twice. He had eventually taken down a copy of Washington Irving's sketchbook and turned to find her looking at him, and he had not flinched or pretended he had not noticed. He had simply held up the book and said, "Have you read this one?" 3 times, she had said. "Which part is your favorite?" "Rip Van Winkle," she had said, "because of what it says about time. About how a man can lose years without knowing it and find the world entirely changed when he wakes up." He had looked at her for a long moment with those gray-green eyes doing their calculating work. "That's not usually the part people choose," he had said. "I'm not usually the person people expect," she had told him, and that had been the beginning. For 3 years they had moved in the careful, deliberate orbit of two people who understood that what was happening between them was serious and did not require rushing. He had stayed in Cartwright's flat and found work as a surveyor and part-time trapper, and he had learned the land around the town the way some men learn a language, with full devotion and increasing fluency. He had come into the store twice a week, sometimes for supplies and sometimes just to talk to her over the lending library shelf, and those conversations had ranged across everything from the nature of God to the best way to preserve venison and back again. And Ellen had understood by the time she was 19 that she would love this man for the rest of her life, whether it was convenient or not. He had told her about the mountain the year she turned 19. Mount Caldwell, the locals called it, which was not its proper name but had become its name after the Caldwell family had tried and failed to homestead its lower slopes in 1869. It rose behind and above Cartwright's flat to the west, and on clear days its upper ridges were visible from the main street of town, snow-capped until June and again from September. Oliver had been surveying its lower territories for a timber company out of Denver, and somewhere in the process of measuring and mapping it, he had fallen in love with it. "There's a valley up there," he had told her, leaning on the counter of her father's store with the September light coming through the window and turning his hair darker than usual. "About 3,000 feet up on the south-facing side. A creek runs through it. There's wild grass and a stand of aspen and a view down the valley that makes everything else seem small." "Everything else meaning the whole world?" she had asked. "Everything else meaning all the noise," he had said. He had paused, searching for the word with the careful attention he gave to language. "All the friction of living among people who want things from you and expect things of you and never quite let you be quiet inside yourself." She had understood that about him. It was one of the things she had always understood without needing it explained. Oliver Shepard was not a misanthrope. He liked people, was genuinely kind and curious about them, but he carried a deep need for solitude the way some people carry a chronic thirst, always present, never entirely satisfied by ordinary means. "I want to build something up there," he had told her. "A cabin, something real and mine." "And then what?" she had asked. He had looked at her with those water-colored eyes. "And then I want you to see it," he had said simply. She had gone home that evening and stood on the porch of her father's house and looked up at Mount Caldwell against the darkening sky and felt something open in her chest like a door. And she had known that whatever came next between her and Oliver Shepard would define the rest of her life. What had come next was a proposal and an acceptance and a wedding planned for the following summer, and a happiness that Ellen had worn like a second skin through the winter and into the spring. And then had come the letter. Not Oliver's letter, her letter. The one she had written in April of 1877, 3 months before the wedding, when she had found out something that had broken her open like a hammer finding a fault line in stone. She had been going through papers in her father's store, the lending library ledger mostly, tracking which books were out, and to whom, when she had found a document she was not supposed to find. Her father had left it tucked inside an old ledger by accident, or perhaps by the unconscious carelessness of a man who had kept a secret long enough to grow tired of the weight of it. It was a letter from a man in Denver named Hartley Morrison, who was, Ellen would discover, one of the principal investors in the timber company Oliver was surveying for. The letter was addressed to George Hale, and it discussed, with the blunt efficiency of men conducting business, an arrangement that had been made. Oliver Shepard's survey of Mount Caldwell's timber resources had been delivered to Hartley Morrison's company. in exchange for ensuring that the survey was accurate and complete, and that Shepard would continue to cooperate with any subsequent operations the company wished to conduct in the area. Morrison had agreed to forgive a substantial debt that George Hale owed him. A debt that, if called in, would have destroyed the store and likely the house with it. Ellen had read the letter 3 times before she understood what it meant. Her father had, at some point, offered Oliver's professional cooperation as a bargaining chip in his own financial dealings. He had done it without Oliver's knowledge, without Ellen's knowledge, and presumably without any awareness of how thoroughly it would unravel the life his daughter was planning. Because Ellen knew Oliver. She knew that if she told him what her father had done, he would not quietly absorb it. He was not the kind of man who swallowed injustice and went on. He would confront her father, and her father, who was simultaneously a proud and a weak man in the particular combination that tends to produce catastrophe, would likely respond with the kind of defensive escalation that would destroy everything. The store, the house, the wedding, her family's reputation in a town where reputation was one of the few currencies that mattered. She had made a choice that she had regretted every single day since. She had not told Oliver. Instead, she had written to Hartley Morrison in Denver and told him she knew about the arrangement and that she wanted it dissolved. She had offered, in exchange, to provide Morrison with additional survey information she claimed Oliver had not included in his official report's information about a secondary timber stand on the eastern slope that was, she said, more accessible and more valuable than what Oliver had already surveyed. It was a lie. She had no such information. She had been buying time and hoping Morrison would respond before she figured out what to actually do. What she had not anticipated was that Oliver would find out about the letter. She did not know, even now 6 years later, exactly how it had happened. She suspected Morrison's people had talked, or that someone in the Denver office had been indiscreet, or possibly that Oliver's surveying work had taken him close enough to the eastern slope to know there was no secondary stand worth speaking of, and that whatever story was circulating about additional survey information had reached him and not added up. What she knew was that 3 weeks before the wedding, Oliver had come to her at the store with something different in his face. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and more devastating than anger. Something that looked like grief wearing anger's clothes. "Did you write to Hartley Morrison?" he had asked. She had told him yes. She had not been able to lie to those gray-green eyes. "About survey information you claimed I hadn't reported." "Yes. That information doesn't exist, Ellen. I know." He had stood very still, the way animals stand still when they are deciding whether the danger is real. "Why did you do it?" And here was where she had made her second mistake, which was larger than the first. She had panicked. She had been afraid that if she told him the full truth, about her father's letter, about the debt, about the arrangement, he would do exactly what she feared, would confront her father, would pull on the thread and unravel everything. She had lost her nerve at the critical moment. "It was a misunderstanding," she had said. "It got out of hand. I was trying to help my father with something and I made a mistake." It was not enough. She could see it was not enough even as she said it. There was too much missing from the explanation, too many obvious gaps, and Oliver was not the kind of man who failed to notice gaps. "Help your father with what?" he had asked. "He had some financial trouble. There was a man in Denver who was owed money, and I thought she had stopped, because she could hear how it sounded. How it sounded was, I used your professional reputation to conduct negotiations I had no business conducting, and I lied about your work, and I did all of this without telling you. You interfered in my professional work," he had said very quietly, "without telling me, to help your father with a problem you didn't tell me about either. Oliver, were you going to tell me? I was going to fix it first." He had looked at her for a long time. She had watched something move through his face that she could not name and has spent 6 years trying to name since. "I need some time," he had said finally, "to think about this." She had nodded. She had believed him. She had believed he would take a few days, maybe a week, And then he would come back and they would have the full conversation, the one where she told him everything about the letter and her father's debt, and all the real reasons she had done what she did. And he would be angry, and then he would understand, because he had always understood her better than anyone. He had not come back in a few days. He had not come back in a week. He had sent a note to her father's house, brief and formal, saying that he needed more time and asking that the wedding be postponed. Ellen had written back asking to see him, asking to talk, and her letter had gone unanswered. And then the day of the original wedding had come, and she had been in that church not because she was foolish or deluded, but because she had been told, by his cousin, James Morrison, who was the only intermediary she had, that Oliver was considering returning and wanted her to wait. So she had waited for 45 minutes in a white dress while the candles burned down and her father turned red and her mother wept quietly in the first pew and the congregation shifted and whispered. He had not come. 2 days later she had learned that Oliver Shepard had gone up Mount Caldwell to the valley he had told her about, to the cabin he had been building, and that was where he had stayed. For 6 years, she had never told anyone the full truth of it. Not her mother, who had died 2 years after the wedding that wasn't, not her father, who had never once acknowledged what she had found in his ledger, not her closest friend Clara Patterson, who had held her hand through that terrible wedding morning and had been holding it in various forms ever since. The story everyone knew was simply that Oliver Shepard had stood her up. The hidden truth, her father's debt, the letter she had written, the choice she had made and the mistake she had made in making it remained hers alone. And now he was down off the mountain. She spent the rest of the morning at the communal baking table, not allowing herself to think about what she would do if she saw him. The spring gathering in Cartwright's flat was an annual event that dated back to the town's founding in 1869, 3 days of trading and socializing, and shared meals at the end of April, when the winter's isolation had worn everyone down to the bone, and the first warmth was something worth celebrating together. People came from as far as 20 miles out. There was a market, and a dance on the second evening, and horse trading on the third morning, and food in quantities that would have seemed obscene on an ordinary day but felt exactly right after months of conserving. Ellen had helped organize it for the last 4 years. She knew every inch of the gathering ground, which was the flat meadow at the eastern edge of town where the creek widened before it turned south. She could not avoid it without explanation, and she refused to hide. She had been hiding from the truth of what had happened for 6 years. She was 26 years old and tired of small lives built around avoidance. So she finished the bread and helped carry it to the long tables and tied her dark hair back under her sunbonnet and went to do the work of the morning. And she told herself that if she saw Oliver Shepard, she would be civil and composed, and give him no indication of the 6 years of grief and longing, and suppressed anger that had been aging like something strong and difficult in the cellar of her chest. She lasted until mid-afternoon. She was at the far edge of the market when she turned to avoid a collision with a man carrying a barrel and found herself facing a broad chest in a dark canvas jacket, and she looked up and it was him. He was different. Dottie had been right about that. 6 years on a mountain alone had done something to him, had stripped away the last softness of young manhood and left something denser and more elemental behind. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps he was only more present, more solid in the world in some way she could not immediately articulate. The beard was real and substantial, dark brown going to a slight red in the afternoon light. He had lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there before. His hands, which had always been a working man's hands, were rougher now, calloused in new places. His eyes were the same. That gray-green winter creek, that perpetual quality of calculating something just below the surface. They found her with no hesitation and held. "Ellen," he said, one word, her name. 6 years of silence in the air between them, and then her name in his voice, which she had not heard in 6 years and which apparently had been stored somewhere in her body that was not accessible to her conscious mind, because hearing it produced a physical sensation in her sternum that she was not prepared for. "Oliver," she said. They stood looking at each other while the spring gathering moved around them, people and noise and the smell of wood smoke and horses and fresh bread. The ordinary world conducting its business with complete indifference to the extraordinary weight of this moment. "You look well," he said, which was clearly not what he had intended to say. She could see that in the slight shift of his jaw, the faint impatience with himself. "You look different," she said. "Bigger. Mountain living," he said. "So I've heard." A silence. Not the comfortable silences they had once been so easy with. This one had texture and weight and the accumulated pressure of 6 years pressing in from every side. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "I help organize it," she said. "I've helped organize it for 4 years. Something moved in his face. "I didn't know that." "There are probably quite a few things you don't know," she said, and heard the edge in her own voice and was not entirely sorry for it. "Given that you've been up a mountain for 6 years." He absorbed that. "Yes," he said simply, "there are." "Why did you come down?" she asked. The question was out before she had decided to ask it, propelled by 6 years of needing the answer. He looked at her for a long moment. Around them the gathering continued its cheerful noise. A child ran past with a hoop. 2 men haggled over a mule price somewhere to their left. "I heard something," he said, "in November from James, something I needed to come down and find out about." "What?" she said. "Your father died," he said, "last autumn." The breath went out of her. "James told you." James felt I should know. She had not cried properly for her father. He had died in October of a heart condition that had been advancing for 2 years, and she had nursed him through the last of it, and there had been grief, but also a complicated grief, the kind that comes tangled with old resentments and unresolved truths and the particular exhaustion of caring for someone you have not entirely forgiven. "I'm sorry for your loss," Oliver said, and she could hear that he meant it, even though the relationship between him and her father had been, well, complicated, did not begin to cover it. "Thank you," she said. "Ellen," he said her name again, differently this time, with more weight under it. "He told me before he died. He wrote to James and asked him to make sure I knew." Her blood went cold. "What did he tell you?" "About the letter," Oliver said. "The one he wrote to Hartley Morrison in 1876. About the arrangement he made. About your survey being," he stopped. "About using my work as a bargaining chip without my knowledge." She stood very still. The world continued to move around her. She was not breathing. "He told you," she said. "He told James, who brought it to me in November." Oliver's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear what was under the control, something that had been living with him the way the truth had been living with her, pressed down and preserved and never entirely quiet. He was dying and he wanted. I think he wanted someone to know the whole truth. I think it was guilt, finally, after all these years. "After all these years," she repeated softly. "Ellen." He took a step toward her, which narrowed the distance between them to something that felt like a provocation to her nervous system. "I need to talk to you. Not here. Not in the middle of all this. Somewhere we can actually, will you talk to me?" She should have said she needed to think about it. She should have said this was not a good time, or that she was busy, or any of the reasonable self-protective things a woman of sense would say to the man who had not come to her wedding, and had then spent 6 years on a mountain without explanation. "Yes," she said instead, because she was 26 and tired, and the truth had been fermenting for 6 years, and it was finally time. They met that evening at the edge of the creek, where the gathering ground ended, and the willows began their slow process of greening in the April cool. She had gone home to her father's house, now hers, the store and the house and the small lending library all transferred to her upon his death, and changed from her working dress to a dark green wool that was neither festive nor severe. And she had let her hair down from the bonnet and pinned it simply at the back of her neck. And she had stood in front of the small mirror in her bedroom and told herself that whatever happened tonight, she would be truthful. She would tell him everything. She would not protect her father's memory at the expense of her own. Oliver was already at the creek when she arrived. He was standing with his back to the water, and in the fading evening light he looked like something from a different world, which he had been, literally, for 6 years. He had taken off the canvas jacket and was in a dark shirt with his sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the evening chill, which she noted was a thing he had always done, the sleeves, regardless of temperature, as though he needed his hands to have room to work even when he was not working. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Of course," she said. They stood apart from each other by about 6 feet, which felt like the right distance for what they needed to do, far enough for honesty, not so far that the words would get lost. "I want to tell you what I should have told you 6 years ago," she said before he could start, because she was not going to let him carry the whole weight of this. She was going to share it, finally, the way she should have shared it with him the moment she found her father's letter in that ledger. He was still listening. "I found my father's letter to Morrison in April of 1877, she said. "I was going through the store records and it was there by accident. I read it and I understood what he had done, and I understood that if you found out you would confront him and that he would. I was afraid of what it would cost. Not just the money, the whole structure. The store, the house, my mother's situation, everything." She stopped. She started again. "I was afraid of the truth, and so I decided to manage it instead of telling you, and when I wrote to Morrison it was because I thought I could buy enough time to figure out a way to resolve it quietly. It was wrong. It was wrong of me not to trust you with it immediately." "Why didn't you just tell me when I asked?" he said. His voice was very even. She had always respected that about him, the way he kept himself even when he was not, she suspected, even at all. "Because I panicked," she said. "Because by the time you came to me and asked about the letter, the whole situation had gotten tangled in ways that felt impossible to explain quickly, and I was afraid that if I told you only part of the truth you would fill in the rest with something worse than what actually happened." "What could have been worse than what I imagined?" he said, and there was something raw in his voice now, the evenness beginning to fracture. "Ellen, I spent weeks thinking you had deliberately deceived me. That you had been using my work, using me for your family's benefit without any intention of telling me the truth." "I know," she said. "And then when I came to you, and you wouldn't explain it." "I know. I thought the whole thing had been." He stopped. He looked away at the creek, at the willows, at something over her shoulder. She waited. "I thought the person I believed you to be was not the person you were," he said finally. "And that was the thing I could not stay for. Not the interference, not even the deception in the moment. It was the possibility that I had been wrong about who you were entirely." "You weren't wrong," she said quietly. "I made a terrible choice, and I made it worse by not being brave enough to explain it when you gave me the chance. But I was never trying to use you. I was trying to protect people I loved from consequences I was afraid of. That is different from hidden motives or betrayal, even though I understand completely why it looked like those things from where you were standing." He turned back to her. The last of the daylight was behind him now, and his face was in shadow, but his eyes were still that gray-green color that had been the color of important things in her life since she was 17. "I know," he said. "I know that now. James brought me your father's letter, and it was all there, all the things you hadn't said, the debt, the arrangement, the way you had tried to protect them." He paused. "Your father also said in his letter to James that you had never told anyone, that you had carried it alone for 6 years. "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Because I felt that I had forfeited the right to explain myself when I chose not to do it in the moment it mattered." She looked at him directly. "And because telling people the truth about my father felt like it would do no one any good once it was over. You were gone. He was sick. What would the truth have accomplished except to give me some relief from carrying it?" He made a sound that was not quite a word. He put his hand over his face briefly, a gesture of someone pressing hard against the understanding of something. Then he dropped his hand and looked at her. "I left you standing in that church," he said. "For 45 minutes. Yes. I spent 2 days trying to decide whether to go back, and then I went up the mountain instead. And I have spent 6 years telling myself it was because I needed to know who I was when I wasn't trying to hold everything together for other people. And that was part of it, but the other part was that I was." He stopped again. The words seemed to require physical effort. I was afraid of what it would mean if I had been wrong about you, of having to look at you and know I didn't trust my own judgment. Ellen felt something shift inside her, not toward him exactly. She had always been toward him, but around him. Something that had been braced and defensive and waiting for impact began, slowly and carefully, to release. "You weren't wrong about me," she said again. "I am still the person you knew, a little older and a great deal wearier and considerably less inclined to manage things quietly when being honest would serve better, but the same person." "I know," he said. That was the other thing James's letter made clear. You never told anyone. You never tried to make yourself look better by telling people what your father had done. You just carried it. It was mine to carry. It shouldn't have been only yours." They stood in the gathering dark, the creek moving behind him with its private sound, the distant warmth of the gathering fire visible through the willows, the smell of April moving through everything, new earth and cold water, and the particular green smell of things beginning again after long dormancy. "Why did you really come down?" she said. "Not just because my father died. James could have written to you. He didn't need to. You didn't need to come in person for that." Oliver was quiet for a moment. A log shifted in the distant fire and sent a spray of sparks up against the dark sky. "I came down because when James told me what your father's letter said, the first thing I felt was not vindication or relief or even anger. The first thing I felt was he stopped. He seemed to be having a genuine struggle with the words. I felt grief that you had been alone with it, that you had spent 6 years with something that heavy and nobody to share it with. And he exhaled. I realized I had put you in that position. Not only your father, me too, because I left." Ellen's eyes were burning. She would not cry. She had not cried about this in 6 years, and she was not going to start in a field at the edge of a creek while the spring gathering made its warm noise through the willows. "You could not have known," she said. "I should have come back," he said simply. "Whatever I believed you had done, I should have come back and made you explain it properly, instead of going up that mountain and staying there until your father was dead and I had run out of reasons to stay away." He looked at her with those eyes, and the grief in them was real and unperformed. "I wasted 6 years, Ellen, and I don't know if there's any recovering from that. But I couldn't stay up there any longer without at least coming down and saying that to you, that I was wrong to leave, and I have known for a long time that I was wrong, and I am sorry." The burning in her eyes became something she could not contain. She turned her face aside and pressed her lips together and breathed through it, and then she turned back. "I was wrong first," she said. "We can argue about who was wronger another time," he said, and something that might have been a very small smile moved through the beard. It startled a sound out of her that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. "That's not a word," she said. "Wronger." "I know," he said. "I've had 6 years up a mountain with limited opportunities for quality conversation. My vocabulary has suffered." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. The creek moved between its banks. The willows breathed. "Are you going back up?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "I haven't decided anything beyond coming down and finding you." "Finding me," she repeated. "Yes," he said. "You were the reason I came, not the gathering, not the supplies, you." She thought about 17 years old, and a man leaning over books in her father's store. She thought about the 3 years of conversations over the lending library shelf, the slow, careful orbit of 2 serious people who understood that what they had was not ordinary. She thought about a white dress and 45 minutes and 6 years of carrying something alone. "You should stay for the gathering," she said. "All 3 days. And then I think we have more to say to each other than one evening at a creek can hold." He looked at her with careful attention, as though parsing the full meaning of what she was offering. "Yes," he said, "I think we do." She went home that night with the distinct sensation of something that had been frozen beginning, very carefully, to thaw. The second day of the gathering was warm in the particular way of Colorado April, the kind of warmth that makes promises it might not keep, but is generous and convincing while it lasts. Ellen was at the trading market early, helping Clara Patterson arrange the table of preserves and dried goods that Clara's family contributed every year, when she looked up and saw Oliver across the flat, talking to Harlan Teague. He was different in daylight than he had seemed in the emotion of the previous evening. More ordinary, in the sense that he moved through the ordinary world like someone learning the steps of a dance he had once known and was now slightly uncertain of. He shook Harlan's hand a little formally. He accepted a cup of coffee from someone and held it with both hands, which was a thing she remembered about him, the way he always held warm things with both hands as though the warmth were something to be held onto. Clara appeared at her elbow. Clara Patterson had been her friend since they were girls, and she had the particular quality of close friendship that involves very little requirement of explanation. "So," Clara said. "Clara," Ellen said. "He came to see you," Clara said, "specifically." "I heard it from 3 separate people this morning, each of whom had a different theory about why, and all 3 theories were wrong, which means the right answer is something none of us have access to." She paused. "Unless you would like to give us access." Ellen looked at Oliver across the flat. He had seen her. He raised the coffee cup slightly in acknowledgement, and she felt the gesture in her ribcage. "He knew things he hadn't known before," she said carefully, "about why things happened the way they happened 6 years ago. He came down to say certain things that needed to be said. Between the 2 of you, yes." Clara was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough to be significant. "Ellen, what do you want? Not what is sensible or safe or what the town is going to think about it. What do you actually want?" Ellen considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I want the conversation to keep going," she said finally. "I want to find out what is left after everything that happened when we can see it clearly. She stopped. She started again. "I want to know if we are still the same 2 people who could talk for 3 hours over books without running out of things to say. That's what I want." "Then I hope you get it," Clara said, with a warmth that had nothing performative about it. Oliver appeared at the edge of their table 20 minutes later. He nodded to Clara with a politeness that had a slight uncertainty in it, the look of a man who knows he may not be warmly received and is prepared to accept that. "Miss Patterson," he said. "Mr. Shepard," Clara said, with a precise neutrality that managed to communicate nothing while implying everything. Then she picked up a basket of preserves and said she needed to speak to someone on the other side of the market, which was the most gracious possible exit, and which Ellen felt grateful for. Oliver looked at the table of goods with apparent interest. "You do this every year?" he asked. "I help Clara," she said. "I contribute from the store, books mostly, and some goods. The library lends out extra copies during the gathering to anyone from out of town who wants them. The lending library is still running." He looked genuinely pleased by this, and the pleasure was so unguarded that it caught her off balance. "Larger than before," she said. "My father never really cared much about it, but I've expanded it considerably since it became mine." She paused. "I ordered things from Denver, philosophy and natural history and some fiction that people say is scandalous but mostly isn't." "What counts as scandalous in Cartwright's flat?" "Anything written after 1860 and featuring a woman who has opinions," she said. He laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and genuine, and it was the first time she had heard it in 6 years, and it had not changed at all. She felt that laugh hit her somewhere below her careful composure and rearranged something. "What have you been reading?" she asked. "Up on the mountain, you must have had books." "I had 37, he said. "I've read them all at least 4 times, twice for understanding and twice because I'd forgotten the earlier details by then." 37, she said. "Which ones?" he told her. She listened. They talked about books for 40 minutes, standing at Clara's table with the gathering moving around them. And it was exactly like talking over the lending library shelf, like 18 years old and 17 years old and the beginning of everything. And Ellen felt something dangerous happening to her composure. The dancing that evening was held around the central fire on the gathering flat, with a fiddle played by old Douglas Marsh and a guitar provided by a young man from the Morrison family who was visiting from Denver. And though neither Ellen nor Oliver danced, She because she was helping supervise the food. He because 6 years of mountain living had apparently not kept his dancing skills current. They ended up standing at the edge of the firelight together in the way that two people end up together when the whole evening seems to be nudging them in that direction. "Tell me about the valley," she said. He turned to look at her. The fire was behind her and he was standing half in shadow and half in its light, which gave his face a quality of being two things at once, which she supposed was appropriate. "What about it? You told me once that it had a view that made everything else seem small," she said. "You told me about the creek and the aspen grove. I've thought about it." She paused. "I've thought about it more times than I would like to admit." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The cabin has a porch that faces east. In the morning the light comes over the ridge, and the aspen grove turns gold before anything else, before the shadows have cleared from the rest of the valley. And there's a silence up there that is—" He paused. "It's not empty silence, it's a full silence, the kind that has weather and wildlife and the sound of water running and wind through trees, but no human friction in it, no one wanting anything from you. It sounds like you've been content there," she said. The word content was carefully chosen, not happy. "Content. He thought about it. I've been at peace in the way that something in suspension is at peace, still, held, not moving." He looked at her. "But things in suspension are not alive, not really. They're waiting." "What were you waiting for?" she asked quietly. He did not look away. "I think I was waiting to figure out whether coming back was possible," he said. "Whether any of it, he stopped. Whether I deserved to." Ellen felt that land. She felt it in the same place she had felt his laugh, that spot below careful composure where the real things lived. "You are not the only person who spent 6 years asking that question," she said softly. His jaw tightened. "No," he said. "I don't imagine I was." They stood in the firelight and the fiddle played something slow, and the gathering moved around them, and 6 years of silence settled into a different shape between them. One that was less like a wall and more like ground, something that could be stood on. "Oliver," she said. "Yes. I need to tell you something else, something I have not told anyone." He turned toward her fully, giving her his complete attention in the way he had always been able to do, which was one of the things she had missed most and most specifically. "My father knew," she said. "Before he died, he knew that I had found his letter. He knew that I had tried to intercept the consequences without telling you, and that it had gone wrong and that you had left because of it. He knew all of that." She stopped. "He never apologized to me, not once in 6 years. He let me carry the whole weight of it as though the original letter, the arrangement with Morrison, had been something neutral that I had simply mismanaged. He let the story be about my mistake." Oliver's expression shifted into something harder. "Ellen, I'm not telling you to make him seem worse than he was," she said. "He was a complicated man and he did love me in his way. I'm telling you because you said you came down when you learned I had been carrying it alone. And I want you to understand fully what alone means in this case. It means I had nobody who knew the whole truth. Not my mother before she died. Not Clara. Nobody." He was very still. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me. You're the first person I've told," she said. "Since my father's letter told you the other half, it seemed only right that you should have the whole thing." He reached out and with a care that was almost excessive, covered her hand briefly with his. His hand was very warm and very rough, and the contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds before he withdrew it, but she felt it for much longer than 3 seconds. "I think," he said, "that you are the bravest person I know." "I'm not," she said. "You kept a secret for 6 years that could have justified yourself completely and said nothing," he said. "Not because you didn't want to justify yourself, but because you felt it would have been wrong to use your father's shame as your defense. That is, Ellen, that is not a small thing." She looked at the fire. "I used to wonder," she said, "if I had just told you immediately, that first day, the moment I found the letter, whether everything would have been different." "Yes," he said simply, "it would have been. You would have been angry. I would have been very angry. But I would have been angry at the right thing," he said. "And I would have been angry with you beside me, which is—" He stopped. He seemed to be choosing words very carefully. "Which is something I wanted for my whole life, even when I was trying to convince myself I didn't." She looked at him then. He was looking at the fire now, his profile showing her the lines that 6 years had added to his face, the beard, the additional solidity of him, and underneath all of that the person she had known since she was 17, unchanged in the essential ways that the essential things never change. "I'm going to go back up after the gathering," he said. "There are things I need to think about, and I think better up there, but I would like—" He paused. He turned to look at her. "I would like to write to you if you will allow it, and I would like you to write back." "Letters," she said. "To start," he said, "until we both know what comes after." She thought about it for a moment, giving it the honest consideration it deserved, not rushing, not managing, just thinking about what she wanted and what was true. "Yes," she said, "write to me." His first letter came 3 weeks after the gathering, delivered by the Morrison boy who made a supply run down the mountain every few weeks and was apparently willing to carry correspondence in either direction for a modest consideration. It was 4 pages in Oliver's handwriting, which was precise and slightly unusual, the letters formed with the deliberateness of someone who had taught himself rather than been taught in a traditional way. He wrote about the valley in May, the aspen leaves coming in fully and the creek running high with snowmelt. He wrote about the cabin, describing it in detail that she found she could see completely. The single large room with a sleeping loft, the stone fireplace that had taken him 3 weeks to build properly, the wide porch facing east. He wrote about solitude not as the absence of company but as a particular quality of presence, a fullness that most people misread as emptiness because they were not accustomed to it. And at the end, carefully, he wrote, "I have been thinking about what you said at the fire, about carrying things alone. I would like you to know that whatever you tell me going forward, I will not leave because of it. I may need time to think, as I have always needed time to think, but I will not put a mountain between myself and hard things again. I've learned something about the cost of that." She read the letter 4 times and then wrote back 12 pages. She told him about the lending library and the 3 new shelves she had built herself after her father died, because the carpenter had been busy and she had not wanted to wait. She told him about the women in town who came in not just to borrow books but to sit and talk, and how the library had become a kind of quiet meeting place, and how she had started doing a reading group on Thursday evenings that was officially about literature and practically about everything that women in a small western town in 1883 were not supposed to talk about openly. She told him about her garden, which she had expanded every year and which now produced enough vegetables in summer that she preserved them through winter and was not dependent on the store for anything green from October to May. She told him about the town. The changes 6 years had brought: the new schoolteacher, the telegraph office that had finally come through in 1881, the debate about the railroad spur that had been going on for 3 years and seemed likely to go on for 3 more. And at the end she wrote, "I find that writing to you is alarmingly easy, which I suspect it should not be given everything. But I have always found it easier to say true things to you than to anyone else, even when I was not managing to do it, especially then. I think that means something, though I am not entirely sure what." The letters went back and forth through May and into June, growing longer and more unguarded with each iteration. He told her things about his 6 years on the mountain that she suspected he had not told anyone. The first winter, which had been very bad and during which he had come closer to real danger than he had admitted to himself at the time. A spring illness in his 3rd year that had left him weak for 2 months and frightened of his own solitude in a new way. The work he had done not just to survive, but to build something enduring, the fences and improvements and the small orchard he had planted 4 years ago that had just begun to bear. She told him about her mother's death and the grief of it, complicated by the secrets she carried. She told him about the period after her mother died when she had run the store alone for 8 months before her father had recovered enough from his own grief to be useful again. She told him about the night she had sat in the lending library after closing and read through every book on the shelf looking for something. She was not sure what, and had eventually found it in a battered copy of Marcus Aurelius that someone had returned with annotations in the margins. Someone's whole private struggle with loss and purpose written in pencil between the printed lines of the Meditations. He wrote back, "I know that feeling, of looking for the thing that will make the weight manageable. I have found it inconsistently and never permanently, but I have found it in work and in certain passages in certain books, and I will tell you honestly in thinking about the conversation we had at the creek, about what you said. I am still the person you knew. I have returned to that sentence more times than is probably reasonable." She wrote back, "I return to things you have said with unreasonable frequency also. This is perhaps simply what it means to have been young and serious together and then separated, and now in letters again. Or perhaps it is something else. I am not quite ready to say which." He wrote back, "I am quite ready to say which, but I will wait until I can say it to your face, because some things should not be written and then folded and carried over a mountain on horseback." She put that letter down on the counter of the store and stood looking at it for a long time with her heart doing something complicated and, she thought, absolutely appropriate. He came down in July. He did not write to say he was coming. He simply appeared at the door of the store on a Tuesday morning in the third week of the month, larger than the doorframe seemed to expect, with his hair longer than it had been in April and his beard trimmed short, as though he had made an effort but stopped before going all the way. She was behind the counter cataloging a new delivery of books. She looked up and he was there, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You trimmed the beard," she said. "The full version was getting inconvenient," he said. "It was catching on things." "The mountains have a great many things to catch on," she agreed. He came inside. He looked at the new shelves she had told him about in her letters, and she watched him recognize them from her description, watched something move across his face that was pleased in a private way. "You built these yourself," he said. "They were not a question. With some help from Douglas Marsh in the joining, but the measuring and planning were mine." He put his hand on one of the shelves and seemed to be thinking something. Then he turned to look at her. "I came down because I have something I want to say in person," he said, "as advertised." She put down the catalog and gave him her full attention. "Then say it," she said. He took a breath. "I have spent 6 years on that mountain telling myself that the right choice was to stay. That solitude was what I needed, and that the world down here, the whole complicated and demanding business of it, was something I was better off without." He stopped. "I was wrong. Not about the mountain, which is genuinely. It is the most beautiful place I have ever been, and I will never regret building there. But about the rest of it. About what solitude is actually for and what it is not for." She waited. "Solitude is for understanding yourself clearly," he said. "Not for escaping the consequences of understanding yourself clearly. Not for staying hidden from the things that require courage." He was looking at her with complete directness. "I love you, Ellen. I loved you when we were young, and I was too frightened to fight for us when things became difficult. And I have loved you through 6 years of considerable effort to convince myself otherwise. And I would like, if you are willing, to stop conducting this relationship primarily through letters." The world outside the store was doing its ordinary July business. 2 horses were tied at the post across the street. A wagon was passing. The telegraph office had its door open. All of it normal, all of it utterly peripheral to what was happening in the lending library corner of George Hale's general store. "I love you too," she said. "I have loved you since I was 17 and watched you read book spines for 20 minutes and then turn around and ask me which part was my favorite. I have loved you through 6 years of carrying a secret I should have shared with you immediately, and through 6 years of believing you were up a mountain because you had decided I was not worth the complication, and through 2 months of letters that have been the most honest exchange I have had with another human being since the years before everything went wrong." He crossed the store in 4 steps, and she came around the end of the counter in 2, and they met in the middle. and he put both hands on her face with the same careful excess of care he had used when he briefly covered her hand at the gathering fire. And she put her hands against the front of his shirt, and he looked at her for one more long moment with those gray-green eyes doing their calculating work. And then he kissed her, and it was not a tentative or exploratory kiss. It was the kiss of two people who have been waiting for 6 years and are done waiting, and it lasted until the door of the store opened and young Thomas Marsh came in for licorice and stopped dead in the doorway with his mouth open. They separated. Thomas Marsh backed out the door. Oliver's hands were still on her face. "I would very much like to court you properly," he said, "if you will allow it." She was smiling in spite of herself. She had not smiled like this, wide and undefended and slightly helpless about it, in a very long time. "Given that we have just kissed in the general store where half the town shops regularly," she said, "I think the courting may be somewhat moot as a formal matter." "Nevertheless," he said, "I want to do this correctly." "Yes," she said, "you may court me, Oliver, correctly and in the proper fashion." He came down from the mountain again in August and again in September. The second time he came in September, he stayed for 2 weeks, and during those 2 weeks, he helped her repair the porch of the house that had been her father's and was now hers, and she taught him to make a proper pie crust, which he had never managed to achieve on the mountain with any consistency. And they walked in the evenings along the creek and talked in the way they had always talked, about everything and nothing and the serious things below everything. He told her more about his father, who had died when Oliver was 12, and whose absence had shaped him in ways he had spent years trying to articulate. A man who had been genuinely good but deeply restless, who had loved his family and also loved the horizon, and had died reaching for something just beyond it and left Oliver with a deep suspicion of his own restlessness. "I was afraid," he told her on one of their evening walks, "that the mountain was just my version of my father's horizon, that I was running away and calling it self-knowledge." "Were you?" she asked. "Partly," he said, "but partly I genuinely needed it. The silence. The work of building something, the proof to myself that I could be alone and not fall apart." He paused. "The problem was that I needed both, the mountain and this." "Both can be had," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I'm beginning to understand that." She told him things she had never told anyone. About the night after her mother's funeral, when she had stood in the backyard of the house in the dark and tried to feel something beyond exhaustion and had felt nothing, and how frightening that had been. About the way she had built the library and the Thursday reading group as deliberate acts of purpose, things she chose for herself rather than things that had been handed to her. About the fact that she was not certain she had fully grieved the wedding that had not happened, because she had not allowed herself to grieve it properly, had only ever been angry and then resigned and then busy. He listened to all of it with the complete attention that had always been one of his defining qualities, the attention that made you feel that what you were saying was the most important thing being said anywhere in the world at this particular moment. "What would grief have looked like?" he asked her. "If you had let yourself do it properly." She thought about it seriously. "I think I would have had to admit that I was not only angry at you," she said. "I would have had to admit that I missed you, that I wanted you back, and that wanting you back felt like a betrayal of my own anger, and so I kept the anger very close and the wanting at a very great distance." "And now," he said. She looked at him, this large, solid, difficult, beloved man who had spent 6 years on a mountain and had come down for her. "Now the distance seems unnecessary," she said. He proposed to her in October. He had planned it more carefully than most proposals that she later heard about, which tended to be either completely impromptu or elaborately theatrical. He had asked Clara Patterson whether Ellen had any strong feelings about the form these things should take, and Clara had told him, correctly, that Ellen had strong feelings about sincerity and very few about pageantry. So he had waited until they were sitting on the repaired porch of her house in the cooling October evening with coffee and the view of Mount Caldwell visible above the line of the town, its first October snow on the upper ridges, and he had said, "I want to marry you. Not because we should have married 6 years ago, and there is unfinished business between us, Because I want the rest of my life to be lived alongside you specifically, and I want to build something. Not just the cabin on the mountain, but the whole thing, the whole life. With you as the person I come home to and leave with and argue with and sit quietly with and all the rest of it. She had set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. You understand, she had said, that I will not leave the library. I assumed you wouldn't, he said. And I will not leave Cartwright's flat permanently, even if you spend part of the year on the mountain. This is my town. I have built things here. I know that. And I have opinions about everything, and I intend to keep expressing them. Ellen, he said, with the very small smile that appeared in the beard, I fell in love with you over an argument about Washington Irving. I am well aware of your opinions and their frequency. She picked up her coffee cup again. She looked at the mountain. She felt the October evening settle around them, and the answer that had been obvious for quite some time make its way from wherever obvious answers live into something speakable. Yes, she said, I will marry you. They were married in December of 1883, in the same First Presbyterian Church where the wedding had not happened 6 years before, and the gathering that came for the occasion was substantial, because the story of what had happened and what had eventually resolved it had, in the natural way of small-town information, become generally known in its broad outlines if not its precise details. The minister was a different minister than the one who had presided over the gathering 6 years ago. The dress was different, not white, but a deep burgundy that Ellen had chosen, because it was the color she looked best in, and she had long since passed the stage of wedding convention that required her to pretend otherwise. Oliver wore his best dark suit, which Clara had informed him with characteristic bluntness needed pressing, and he had had it pressed. He had also cut his hair, though the beard remained, trimmed close and neat enough that several members of the congregation who had not seen him up close since before the mountain barely recognized him. He was waiting at the altar this time. She walked in on her own, which raised some eyebrows, because she had no father to walk her in, and she had declined the offer of her Uncle Bertram, who lived 12 miles east, and whom she liked but did not love in the way that an arm to walk in on should be loved. She walked in on her own, and she looked straight at Oliver the whole way, and his face when he saw her in the burgundy dress was everything she could have hoped for, which is to say it was absolutely unguarded, completely unperformed, and entirely devoted. They said their vows with the solemnity the occasion warranted and signed the register in the vestry after, and Oliver kissed her in full view of the congregation, and the congregation was delighted, including Thomas Marsh, who had been telling everyone for months that he had been present at a pivotal moment in the story, without being entirely able to explain what the moment had been. That evening there was a celebration at the schoolhouse, with Douglas Marsh's fiddle and the Morrison boys' guitar, and a dinner that the women of Cartwright's flat had organized with the same energy they brought to the spring gathering, and Ellen danced with Oliver for the first time, which was, she would say later, one of the better first times she had experienced, because he danced the way he did most physical things, with complete focus and a competence that had taken practice to acquire. You said mountain living had ruined your dancing, she said, as they turned together through the second song. I practiced, he said. She looked up at him. You practiced dancing, alone, on a mountain. I practiced the basic steps, he said, with dignity. I had limited space and no partner, which was an inherent limitation, but I was determined not to embarrass us both. She pressed her face briefly against his shoulder because she was laughing, and she did not want the whole room to see the full extent of it. His hand tightened at her waist. They spent their first winter between the house in town and occasional weeks on the mountain, which worked better than she had expected, because Oliver had built the cabin with more comfort than the word cabin typically implies, and the months of correspondence had given them an unusually clear picture of each other's practical needs before they had to navigate living them together. She needed a room that was hers alone for reading and thinking. He needed to build things regularly or he became abstract and difficult to reach. She needed the town, the library, the Thursday group. He needed the mountain, or at least access to it, or at least the knowledge that it was there. They navigated it with the same combination of honesty and humor that had characterized their letters, which is to say imperfectly, but with genuine effort and very little hidden motive between them. In February, she told him she was expecting. He received this information while he was repairing the kitchen door, which had been sticking since November, and he put down his tools and sat on the kitchen floor and pulled her down next to him with the complete disregard for furniture and decorum that the moment seemed to require, and held her for a long time without saying anything, which was sometimes the best thing he did. "Are you frightened?" he asked eventually. "Some," she said. "You?" "Considerably," he said, "but in the way that important things are frightening, not in the way that bad things are. There's a difference." "I know," she said. "I have been explaining that distinction to myself since I found out." Their son was born in October of 1884, in the bedroom of the house in Cartwright's flat that had been her father's and was now theirs, delivered by the midwife with Oliver present because Ellen had asked him to be, and he had said yes without hesitation, which had briefly surprised the midwife, and not at all surprised Clara Patterson, who was also present, and who had spent a year watching Oliver Shepard navigate the world with the careful earnestness of a man making up for lost time. They named him William George Shepard, William for Oliver's father and George for Ellen's, which was a choice that took Ellen several weeks to arrive at and which, when she arrived at it, felt right in the way that difficult choices sometimes feel right. Not easy, but honest. William was a serious baby who looked at the world with his father's watchful expression and his mother's refusal to be satisfied with surface explanations. He slept in the loft of the cabin on the mountain during their summer stays and grew accustomed to the sound of the creek and the particular quality of mountain silence from his earliest months. Oliver continued to spend portions of the year on the mountain, doing the work that had sustained the cabin and the small orchard, and the survey contracts he still occasionally took from the Denver company, which had changed ownership and personnel enough that the business with Hartley Morrison was no longer a complication. Ellen ran the store and the library and the Thursday group, and delivered vegetables to half the town from her expanding garden, and wrote letters to Oliver during his mountain stays, that were now shorter and more frequent than the 6-year exile that had preceded them. The lending library grew to the point that she moved it out of the corner of the store and into the adjacent space that had been a storage room, which required a modest renovation that Oliver executed with great thoroughness over the course of 2 weeks in 1886, building new shelves to her specifications and a reading table long enough to seat 6 people, which the Thursday group required. Cartwright's flat changed around them, as towns do. The railroad spur that had been debated for years finally materialized in 1885, bringing more people and more commerce and more of the complicated energy that growth brings to small places. The general store expanded. A proper hotel was built. 2 additional churches were established, one Methodist and one Unitarian, and Ellen's lending library was patronized by members of all 3 denominations, plus a number of people who attended none of them, which she considered the truest possible indication of its success. Clara Patterson married a schoolteacher from the new school in 1886, a quiet, thoughtful man named Robert Frayne, who fit into the network of friendship with such natural ease that Ellen told Oliver he seemed like someone they had always known. The question of her father's debt to Hartley Morrison was resolved by the passage of time and the departure of Morrison from the territory. She never knew what had happened to the original debt, whether it had been settled or simply abandoned when Morrison's Denver enterprise moved on to other ventures in the mid-1880s. She made her peace with not knowing. Her father's complicated legacy in her life had been addressed as fully as it was going to be, and she had stopped spending energy on what could not be changed. One evening in the summer of 1887, She was on the porch of the cabin on Mount Caldwell watching the aspen grove go gold in the evening light, as Oliver had described it doing in mornings, and as she had discovered it also did in evenings, the light turning everything briefly to something that looked like a standing fire before the dark came down. William, who was 2.5 and extremely determined about the world, was inside being persuaded by his father that sleep was a reasonable enterprise. Oliver came out and sat next to her in the second chair he had added to the porch the previous year, and they sat together in the full silence he had described to her in letters, the silence that was not empty, the silence full of water and wind and the breathing of a mountain that had been standing long before either of them arrived and would stand long after. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "Are you happy?" he said. "Not content, not managing, happy." She looked at the aspen grove and its evening gold. She thought about the lending library and the Thursday group and the garden and the burgundy wedding dress, and the morning she had been 17 and watched this man read book spines with complete absorption. She thought about the letter she had written and the one her father had written and the 6 years between, and the creek at the spring gathering, and the 12 pages she had written back to his first 4, and William asleep in the loft above them with his father's watchful expression. "Yes," she said. Completely and specifically, and in the way that is not the absence of hard things but the presence of real ones. "Yes." He reached over and took her hand, and she turned her palm up and held his, and they sat on the porch of a cabin on Mount Caldwell while the aspen grove finished its evening, and the dark came quietly over the valley, and nothing needed to be said because everything important had already been said, most of it in letters and some of it at a creek in April, and some of it in a general store in July, and some of it at an altar in December in a burgundy dress, and the rest of it simply in the ongoing and ordinary and extraordinary fact of being two serious people who had chosen each other in the end, correctly and at last. Their second child, a daughter they named Alice Josephine Shepard, came in the spring of 1889, when William was 4 years old and deeply skeptical of the arrangement. He came around within 2 weeks, when it became clear that Alice was going to be an exceptionally alert baby who watched him with the same intense focus he used to watch the world, which he correctly identified as a quality of character he could respect. The spring gathering of 1890 was the first time Ellen organized it with Oliver actively helping, which he did with the particular combination of thoroughness and impatience that characterized all his practical efforts, things done very well and then done, with little patience for the organizational conversations that surrounded the doing. She teased him about this, and he accepted the teasing with the very small beard smile, and Clara Franchi was Clara Frayne now watched the two of them argue over the placement of the market tables, with the expression of someone watching something they have been rooting for finally and fully arrive. Ellen was 33 that spring gathering. Oliver was 36. William was 5 years old and already asking to come on the mountain in the summer with his father, and Alice was 14 months and more interested in the world than the world was quite prepared for. The lending library had 241 volumes and a waiting list for popular titles. The garden produced enough that Ellen had begun, quietly and without much announcement, selling preserved goods through the store in winter at prices calibrated to be accessible to people who couldn't otherwise afford such things, which was a form of stubborn practical generosity that Oliver found completely characteristic and completely her. At the second evening of the spring gathering of 1890, when the fiddle was playing and the fire was warm, and the community of Cartwright's flat was doing what it did every April, gathering itself back together after winter, remembering that it was not a collection of separate, isolated households, but a thing shared. Oliver found her at the edge of the firelight, in approximately the same place they had stood 7 years before, the year he had come down for the first time in 6 years. 7 years ago, he said. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about it all day. You were standing there." He pointed to a spot about 3 feet to her left, "and you asked me why I came down." You said you'd heard something from James. I said I'd heard your father died, he said, which was true, but not the whole truth. She looked at him. What was the whole truth? The whole truth was that when James told me your father was dead, the first thought I had before the grief for you, before anything sensible, was that the last reason I had invented to stay away from you was gone. He paused. I had told myself that as long as your father was alive and the situation between us was the shape it was, there was no way to approach it that didn't risk making things worse. And then he was dead, and I was standing in my cabin with James's letter, and the truth was. Oliver, she said softly, the truth was that I had been looking for reasons to come back for years, he said, and I had been finding reasons to stay away instead. And that night I couldn't find the reason anymore, so I came down. She put her hand against the front of his coat, which was a habit she had developed, that particular placement, as though checking for the continued presence of his heartbeat. That is the most honest thing you have ever said to me, she said, and you are a very honest man. I have been trying, he said. He covered her hand with his. More every year. The fire crackled and sent sparks up into the April dark. Somewhere behind them, William had found Douglas Marsh and was demanding to know how the fiddle worked. Alice was on Clara Frane's hip, regarding the fire with her mother's evaluating expression. I'm glad you came down, Ellen said. I know, he said. I was terrified when I heard your name, she said. I was working bread dough and Dottie Marsh said your name and everything stopped. And then I thought, it has been 6 years and I am 26 years old and I am done being afraid of the truth, she said. And I went to the creek that evening and told you everything I should have told you in 1877. You did, he said. Best decision I made since I opened the library, she said. He laughed, the real sudden laugh that had not changed at all, and she felt it in all the same places she always felt it, and in the firelight on the gathering flat of Cartwright's flat, Colorado, in the spring of 1890. She looked up at the man she had loved since she was 17, and felt the extraordinary, ordinary completeness of a life that had found its way to what it was supposed to be, not easily, not without cost, not without years of silence and secrets and the grinding patience that truth requires, but finally, fully, and without reservation. He kissed her at the edge of the firelight, and the gathering went on around them, and William found them 2 minutes later to demand an explanation of musical instruments, and Alice reached for her mother's hair with the absolute authority of 14 months, and the mountain stood to the west against the dark sky, and the aspen grove was up there in the dark going quietly about the business of being alive in spring, and all of it. The mountain and the town and the library, and the people she had made and the man she had chosen was hers, and right and real. In the autumn of 1891, Oliver finished a second structure on the mountain, not the cabin itself but a smaller building adjacent to it, connected by the covered porch, with its own fireplace and 2 long walls he built specifically for shelving. He did not tell her what it was for until it was finished, and he brought her up in October to see it, and she stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves empty, waiting, and understood. You built me a library, she said. A reading room, he said. For when you're on the mountain, so you don't have to choose between the books and the view. She put her hand against the doorframe. She looked at the shelves. She thought about a 17-year-old girl watching a man read book spines with complete absorption, and asking which part was her favorite and getting a question back instead of an answer, the best possible answer to any question. Which book goes on the top shelf, he asked. She did not hesitate. She went to the bag she had brought up with her and took out a battered copy of Washington Irving's sketchbook. She put it on the top shelf, far left, where a library begins. He put both hands on her face, that careful excessive care, and she put her hands against his chest. And outside the reading room window the October mountain was doing what it always did, being vast and cold and unimpressed by human concerns, and yet somehow, in the way of wild and enormous things, entirely accommodating of the small and specific warmth of 2 people standing in a room built of love and second chances, and the stubborn refusal to let the true thing die. Rip Van Winkle, he said. Because of what it says about time, she said, about how a man can lose years without knowing it, and find the world entirely changed when he wakes up, he finished. She looked at him. Is the world changed? She asked. He looked at her with the gray-green eyes that had always been calculating something true just below the surface of whatever he was saying. Yes, he said, completely, and bet her for it. Outside, William was shouting for his father from somewhere near the orchard. Alice, inside the cabin proper, was being supervised by Clara Frayne, who had come up for the occasion and was currently losing a negotiation with a 2-year-old about the acceptability of going to sleep. The creek ran in the valley below the cabin. The aspen grove was in its October gold, holding the last warmth of the afternoon. The view from the eastern porch down the valley, over the ridge, toward the distant flat where Cartwright's flat went about its evening was everything Oliver had said it was when she was 19 and hearing about it for the first time. It made everything else seem small, not unimportant. Small, in the way that small means held in perspective, seen truly, understood as part of something larger and more enduring than any individual fear or mistake or failure of nerve. She had spent 6 years making herself small with the weight of things she carried alone. She was not small anymore. She was Ellen Hale Shepard, 27 books into expanding the mountain reading room, the mother of 2 children who looked at the world with her stubbornness, and his patience in various and promising combinations, the keeper of the largest lending library in a 40-mile radius, the person who made bread for the spring gathering and organized the market tables with more thoroughness than anyone gave her credit for. The woman who had loved a man since she was 17 and been wrong with him and right with him and had crossed 6 years of silence and gotten back to the place they had always been headed. Oliver's hands were warm on her face. The mountain was doing its mountain things outside. The first copy of Washington Irving's sketchbook sat on the top shelf of a reading room that had been built specifically and entirely for her. "Come on," she said. "William is calling." "Let him call a moment more," Oliver said. She laughed and kissed him once more, and then they went out into the October afternoon together to find their son in the orchard and bring in the last of the harvest before the light went. And the mountain held them, and the valley held the mountain, and the story that had taken so long to arrive at its proper shape was, at last and truly, home.